So now we're on Daf Mem Beis Amud Beis. Itmar. Omar Rab Amar Rav Huna. Mikra Mole Diber HaKosuf. We're talking about the din that if a Nazir contracts Tumah multiple times, then he gets Malchus if there was Asra between each one and the other. And the pasuk in Nazir says, Li Aviv Uli Imo Uli Achiv Lachoso Lo Yitamalem B'Mosam. Right? That's the Isur Lav, which in the case of Nazir includes even his closest relatives. He still is enjoined from being mitame to them. And the words Lo Yitame, Lo Yitama, include all sorts of categories of tumah. For example, if he touches a mess, or if he carries a mess without touching, and that's called masa. Or tumas oel. He walks into an oel, and there's a mess in the oel. He violates the Isur Tumah, lo yitama, and he gets malchus. Kishu omer lo yavo, but there's another pasuk. The pasuk that we read was pasuk Zayin, but let's rewind to pasuk Vav. It says al nefesh meis lo yavo. So there are two lavim here. There's one lav of lo yitama, and there's another lav of lo yavo. Comes along Rabbah in the name of Rav Huna, and he says, guess what? You're going to get two sets of malchus in event that the Nazir enters into the Olam Es. One lav that generates malchus lo yitama because he contracts tumah through the oil, and the other is a separate lav, an additional lav of lo yavo, because he entered in to the Olam Es. Is lazir ala tuma and lazir ala bia. There are two separate lavim that enjoin him for two separate reasons or two separate violations. One is the tumah itself that he contracts, and the other is coming into the oil. Okay, fine. That's a big chiddush in and of itself. But that's not the main thrust of what Rabbah wants to teach us here. Aval tuma v'tuma lo. What happens if the Nazir comes in contact with the dead, and while he's touching the dead, he touches another dead body? So he has two hands. One hand comes in contact with one dead body, the other with another dead body. Lo, he doesn't get two sets of malchus. And even if they gave him asra for each negia, nevertheless, he is not chayav malchus for the second mess, for negia with the second mess. And this is the principle called Eino Mosif al Tumasa. The Gemara is going to explain that unless the Tumah adds Tumah, or it begins Tumah, but if it doesn't pile up and add another Tumah, then there's no violation. So again, to summarize, there are two chidushim of Rabbah. One is that he gets two sets of malchus when he enters into an olam mes, one for liovo and the other for litam. And number two, that if it's tumah v'tumah, that while he's in a state of negia b'mes, he touches another mess, he doesn't get an additional set of malchus for touching the second mess. And this is the sheet of Rabbah. And Rabbah is pinning himself on Rav Huna. Rav Yosef says, Elohim, meaning Allah and Shvua, Amar Rav Huna, I have a different tradition in the name of Rav Huna, according to which he gets two sets of malchus, afilu b'tumah v'tumah. So he was nitma v'choz v'nitma, even though the second negia does not add tumah al tumah rishona, nevertheless he gets malchus. And I'll prove it to you from the words of Rav Huna. The Amar Rav Huna, Nazir she'o omed b'beis hakvaros. So he entered into beis hakvaros. He came in contact with a kever, or if he didn't touch a kever, then maybe he leaned over a kever, which is called ha'ahil olav ha'ahil. We make an oil into a verb. Ha'ahil olav b'toch arba amas. And then hoshitu lo meso umes acher. Meso means one of his seven relatives, and a different mess that was not related to him, v'nagaba. So Mesacher means O Mesacher. So the statement of Rav Huna allows for two scenarios. The man is already Tomei, he's in a Beis HaKvaros, he already came in contact with the kever, or he was Mahil over a kever, and then he came in contact with a dead body, either one of his relatives or someone else who's not a relative of his. And Rav Huna told us, he's chayav an additional set of malchus, assuming there was Hasra, for the second Negiah. V'amai, according to you, Rabbah, in the name of Rav Huna, ha mitame v'koyim. He's already in a state of tumah by virtue of the fact that he touched a kever or is mahil al kever. And once he's already tameh, when he comes in contact with a mess, that doesn't add anything. The enamosifa al tumasa. And why would he get a second set of malchus for the negiah b'mes? El lav shmamina. What we see here is Omer Rav Huna. Rav Huna's sheet is not the way you said it, but afilu tumah v'tumah. And you're telling me, Rabbah, that lo yavo as a separate lav is because he entered into the oil. No. Lo yavo as an additional lav is telling me a chiddush of afilu tumah v'tumah, that even though he was already tameh, and then he comes in contact with a mess, he'll get malchus for the second negiah on top of the malchus for the first tumah. And that's called tumah v'tumah, even though the second negiah is not mosif al tumah. So this is the debate between Rabbah and Rav Yosef about Rav Huna. What did Rav Huna mean to learn when he said that there's a separate lav and a separate additional malchus from Lo Yavo? Was he telling me Lo Yavo because he entered into the oil, or Lo Yavo because he contracted Tumal Tumasa? Tumah v'tumah. Esvei Abai raised the following objection to Rav Yosef from Brisa. The Brisa speaks about a Kohen Gadol. So obviously he's in contact with a dead body. They gave him another mess. And V'nogabo, and he can conscious. Yochel, I might think that he should be chayav for the negiah on the second mess, which, according to Rav Yosef's tradition, Einochinami, he violates another additional lav of Lo Yavo, and he gets a second set of malchus. But the Brisa says, Pug Fakir, just the opposite. Talmud Lomar, we're going to derive a conclusion from a drasha, from a miyut in the pasuk, that once he is already in contact with a mess, he will not violate another lav by coming in contact with a second mess. And here we turn to Parshas Emor, and there it says, in Vayikra Chafal of Pasuk Yud Beis, V'lo Yechalel, and the rest of the Pasuk says, Es Migdash Elo Kav. And the Kohen Gadol is enjoined from being Mitame. But again, the Pasuk uses the language Lo Yechalel, that he is now desecrating his Kedushas Kahuna. But only because he was not in a state of desecration, he is now being mechalel. B'misha eno mechulo, he's not tamei, and now he contracts tumah. So a Kohen Gadol who's tar, his contraction, he contracts tumah. Now he becomes a violator of lo yechalel by being mechalel's kedushas kuna yotzeh zeh. But not this Kohen Gadol who's already carrying a dead body on his back, and then he touches another mess. Hu mechul v'yomei. You can't say that he violates the law of lo yechalel because he's already mechulo. So the extra additional contact with a mess that's called tumah shniya does not add anything because he's already mechul v'yomei. And therefore, we see clearly, explicitly from this brisa that a Kohen Gadol does not get malchus if he was already tamei and he was chazav and itma, and the same din should apply to a nazir. So how could you, Rav Yosef, quote Rav Huna as claiming that a nazir gets a second set of malchus in the case of tumah v'tumah? It's against this brisa. Amalei, so Rav Yosef responds to Abaye, v'tikshe loch mas nisim. You know what? You can't ask a kash from the brisa. The brisa is shver from the Mishnah itself. We're going to have head-on collision, a steer between the Brisa and our Mishnah. This now we learned in our Mishnah, even though he was metame the entire day, one after the other. Why? Because there was no asra between one tumah and another. Had they given him asra, then every time that he would come in contact with the dead, he would incur another chiv malchus. It'll get multiple malchus. Amrulo al tutami chayva kolachas v'amai homitami v'koyim. It wasn't as if, he was metame to the first mess, then he went out for 7 days and he was metame himself, then he was metame again. That's not the case. He was consecutively being metame with one contact after the other with different mason. And yet, if there was asra that separates each maisa negia, he gets multiple malkia. So you see clearly from the Mishnah that nitma v'chaz v'nitma is loke pamayim. He gets malchus for every single time. And that's tumah v'tumah. So therefore, Elakasha Adada, you now have a stira between the Mishnah and the Brisa. And we have a rule of thumb that if there's a stira between the Mishnah and the Brisa, we assume that the Brisa is a tos, it's a shabeshta, it's not a reliable Brisa. So don't ask me a kasha from a Brisa that's not reliable. When the Mishnah says that even though there's tumah v'tumah, he will get multiple malchios. Comes along Abaye to answer this kasha of Yosef, lo kasha. There's no steer between the Mishnah and the Brisa. Kan, in the case of the Brisa, which says that he only gets malchus for one chilul, because once he's mechul v'yomed, he doesn't violate and get malchus for lo yechalel. That's a case of bechiburim. But kan in our Mishnah shalo bechiburim. Okay, now we're talking about the second tumah, and that's called tumah bechiburim, and that's where he gets only one set of malchus. So what happens? He is still touching the first mess, and with his other hand, so to speak, he touches the second mess. He gets only one set of malchus. Why? Because the second, the gia b'mes, doesn't add anything to his tumah. But where does the Mishnah talk about a case of tumah v'tumah and he gets two sets of malchus? That's shelo b'chibur. When he came in contact with the second mess, he was no longer in contact with the first mess. So the negia with the second mess adds to his tumah. Now, I was mind-boggled by this. Why? Okay, so he dropped, his physical connection to the first mess, but why does the second mess add anything to his tumah? So the Masechet came to my rescue. And again, there's a long discussion here. And tumah b'chiburin is a big sugya in Taras. But we'll just say it in a very, shall we say, superficial level. Hare, what would happen if after he drops the negir with the first mess, Adam acher yigabo, what would be the status of someone who comes in contact with him, but after he dropped the connection, the hand that was touching the first mess? What would be the status of the person who touches this person? Is the halacha is that's only called tumas erev. Yitma sheni rak ad ha'erev. Now, v'achshav k'shenogea shuv b'mes, if after dropping the first hand-on mess, and now he touches a second mess, if somebody else now comes in contact with him, that person will now contract a tumah of Shivas Yomim, like the din of an ogea b'tamei mes b'chiburin. Kevin shosifa negia shni ala tumah, and therefore lo kegam oleh. So again, once he drops his contact with the first mess, now he's in a low profile state of tumah, because if someone else touches him and he's not being okay in the first mess anymore, that person will only get a tumas error. But now he touches a second tameh, a second mess. That's contact with the second mess now upgrades and intensifies his status of tameh, such that if somebody touches him now while he has contact with the second mess, he'll contract a tumas zayin yom, not just a tumas error. Now, from this answer of Abaye, it comes out that Tuma b'chiburim is on a lower level, meaning if he's touching two mesim, he now touches the second mess while he's still in contact with the first mess. I'm looking at the clock here, and we're supposed to end in 5-6 minutes. So we'll see what we can do, Rabbi. I might have to go overtime a little bit, because now the Gemara is talking about Tuma b'chiburim. And Tuma b'chiburim means that while he's still touching mess number one, he comes in contact that he's touching mess number two. That was Abaye's Tuma b'chiburim. And we said the following, that as long as he's in contact with the dead, if somebody else touches him, that somebody else will contract a tumah of Shiva Yomi. So that puts the tumah on such a high level that when he touches now a second mess, that doesn't add anything, because he's still b'chiburin to the first mess. And already at that point that he's chiburin with the first mess, even before he touches the second mess, the person who comes in contact with him will contract a tumah zayin yomi. And that's doraisa. Because again, we're talking in our Mishnah about a chiyuv malchus for a Nazir, whether he's chayiv one set of malchus or multiple set of malchios. And we're saying that because when he drops, let's say, his contact with the first mess, and therefore, if somebody contacts him, he's only Tomei Erev, there's no Tumah Chiburin. But now he comes in contact with the second mess, that's a Tosefah, he's Mosif Tumah, because now it's already Tumah Chiburim, and if somebody touches him, he'll contract Tumah of 7 days. That was Abai. So what's the Gemara's objection to Abai? V'tumah b'chiburin doraisa? This did that because you came in contact with someone who's actually touching a mess now, and therefore you contracted Tumah Shivas Yomim, that's not a doraisa. And of course, Abai is talking about a doraisa because we're talking about Chiyav Malkios. Om Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef Rabbi Yanai, Lo Amru Tumah b'chiburim Elo Legabi what? Truma v'kachim. So if a person was nitma b'tumah b'chiburim, and therefore we said that since he came in contact with someone who's actually touching a mess now, he's tamei shivas yomim. No. He's not really tamei shivas yomim. He's only osur to eat truma and kachim for those 7 days. Aval in Nazir, Uliosa Pesach lo. So again, Tumah Shiva means it's as if you're touching the dead. You're not touching the dead. You're touching a person, but he's now touching the dead, and he has the upgraded status of Ki'ilu, right, of Tumah B'chibur, and Ki'ilu now the person who comes in contact with is no Ger B'mes Atzma. Even though he's not touching the mess, but he's touching someone who's touching the mes, and it's ki'ilu noga b'mes atzma. But that doesn't apply, says Rabbi Yitzchak, in the case of Nazir and Oseh Pesach. So, for example, we know that Tumah, in the case of a Nazir, is Soser Niziru, so that doesn't apply in Tumah B'chiburim. Or, for example, a person who contracts Tumah is not allowed to bring a Korban Pesach. So what's the status of someone who touches someone who is touching a mess? So the Nazir would not be Soser as Nazirus if he touches a person who's touching a mess. And the person who touches someone who's touching a mess would not be excluded from a Korban Pesach. And that's the law that applies to, in general, someone who comes in contact with a tummy mess. So the fact that that person who's tummy mess is now b'chibur and he's touching a mess doesn't add anything. And this is going to prove that Tumah b'chibur is only the Rabbanan v'iyamit midaraisa ma'ishna. Why should Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef Rav Yanai distinguish between the dinim of a Nazir and Pesach from one side and Truma Kachim on the other side? It must be that Tumah b'chibur is only the Rabbanan. And therefore, you have no right, Abaye, to interpret our Mishnah that says that you have multiple Malkios and interpret as a case of Tumah B'chiburim. Just 1 second. Okay, EF shall levar. That, right. That if he drops his contact with the first mess, and then he comes in contact with the second mess, then he gets what? He gets multiple Malkios. Right? Which was the Mishnah. The Mishnah says he gets multiple Malkios, but it's all based on Tumah B'chiburin. That Tumah B'chiburin upgrades his status. So when he now, after he's no longer touching the first mess, he's touching the second mess, he now contracts Tumah B'chiburin, which would generate a Tumah Shiva for someone who comes in contact with him. Now the question is, why is he prohibited from eating Truma and Kodshim? So far, the Gemara didn't address that question yet. But in any event, as far as the Doraisa of Nazir, to be Soser as Nazirus, or Pesach, to enjoin him from bringing the Korban Pesach, with regard to that, we don't have a din of Tumah B'chibur in Doraisa. So the Gemara answers that it's true that if a person would touch a tummy mess at the moment that he's in contact with a mess, then the tumah of that person is only d'Rabbanan. But nevertheless, if a tummy mess comes in contact with an additional mess, then he's being mosif tumal tumaso midoraisa, and now the Gemara is going to differentiate between two different categories or types of tumah b'chibur. Kan, Rabbi Yanai, who says that the tumah b'chibur is only the Rabbanan, and there was only Xer with regard to Truma and Kodshim, is b'chibure adam ba'adam. So what's the case here? Ruvain comes in contact with Shimon, and Shimon is touching Levi. And Levi is Nogea b'mes. So that's called Chibure Adam be'Adam. And in this particular case, Ruvain contracts Tumah Doraisa, but only Tumas Erev. Midrabanan, he contracts Tumah Shivas Yomim, which enjoins him from eating Truma and Kodshim, but has no implication on a Doraisa level for the Shivas Yomim as far as Nazir and Pesach are concerned. So that's because Ruvain is touching Shimon, and Shimon is touching Levi, It's like a domino theory. And Levi's the one who's touching a mess. But Khan, in the Mishnah that says that the Nazir will incur multiple malkios if he became Tomei, and again he was Chosev in Nitma, and that means that the second Negiah is a Tosefes Tuma, that's a case of Chibure Adam B'mes. That means that Ruvain touches Shimon, and Shimon is touching a mess. So we don't have three people, Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi. We only have Ruvain and Shimon. And in this case, Ruvain contracts Tuma D'Oraisa for Shivas Yomim as if he's touching the mess itself. And that's why the Nazir, Shenitma, V'choz V'nitma, Loke Pamayim, because the Negiah with the second mess adds a Tuma D'Oraisa of Adam B'mes, right? Adam B'mes, as opposed to Adam B'Adam. So the Gemara now rejects this distinction of Abaye because it comes out that according to Abaye, Rabbah, who says Abul Tuma V'Tuma Lo, right? Let's go back to Rabbah for a second. Itmar Omar Rabbah, right? Tuma V'Tuma Lo, that he only gets one malchus if he comes in contact with a second mess. Is that's a case of Tuma B'Chiburin, where he's not Mosif Tum al Tuma, the Ha Mitami V'Koyin, right? He's still in the state of his Tuma, which he contracted with the first Negiah, and he'll get a second set of Malchus for entering into an Oel because of Tuma Ubiyah. So let's say, for example, he's holding on to a mess, he's carrying a mess on his shoulders, and he enters into an Ola mess, then Rabbah's Moda, from that extra pasuk that we derived, that he gets two sets of Malchus. So what's the question now that the Gemara raises the objection against Rabbah? Tuma Ubiyah Nami Hamitami V'Koy. Where's the Tosefes Tuma in a case where he goes into an Oel? He's carrying a mess on his shoulders, so he's tummy. Now he enters into an Ola mess. What additional Tuma is added by entering into an Ola mess? What's the logic to say that in the case of Tuma V'Tuma, he only gets one set of Malchus, but in the case of Tuma Ubiyah, he gets two sets of Malchus? Rabbi Yochanan kan bebayis, kan b'sadeh. When Rabbah says that Tuma Ubiyah, he gets two sets of Malchus, that's a case of someone who is tar, enters into a bias, there's a mess in the bias, and now simultaneously contracts both Tumas Biyah and Tumas Oel. And here the Torah says that he gets two sets of Malchus, one for Lo Yitame and one for Lo Yavam. But when does Rabbah say that in Tuma V'Tuma he only gets one set of Malchus? Kan B'Sada. There's no roof on top. And therefore he's not entering into an Olam mess. It's an open area. And therefore there's no possibility that he gets two sets of Malchus. Why? Because if, let's say, he comes in contact with two Mesim simultaneously, he's touching one mess with one hand and one mess with the other, and he got Asra for both of them, he's not Chayv Shtayim. Why? Because then the Asra is only on the lav of Tuma. There's no Asra on the lav of Biyah because he's out in the field and there's no God. And basically, he gets Malchus only one time. And if he's carrying a dead body on his shoulders, and then somebody shows him a mess, a Hoshid Lo mess, and he touches the mess, he's not going to get an additional set of Malchus because he's already Mechul of Yomi. And only in the case where he was Naga b'meis echad, and then he was Poresh from that mess, he's no longer touching the mess, and now he's no getting a second mess. If the Asros, multiple Asros, he'll get multiple Malchus because the second Negiah is Mosif Tuma. And if somebody touches him after he drops the first mess and picks up the second mess, now he contracts Tumah Shivas Yomi. And the Gemara is not happy with this on the top of Mem Gimel, and the Gemara says, "B'vayis nami came in the Ayel Yodei is toiv, Ayel Kuli Hai Tomehu." But this will have to, in Mirz Hashem, pick up tomorrow. Now, tomorrow is Purim in these parts of the world, but I'm going to try my best to. I'll tell you exactly what time, because it really depends upon Megillah reading and when we finish Shacharis. It's a long davening tomorrow, so I'm not sure exactly what the time schedule is. So, Rabbi, if it's okay with you, I'll be in touch Behemshech regarding tomorrow. Tomorrow's not Purim for you, is it?
No, regular day for us.
So
stay at home and cook.
I'm assuming